Welcome back. I'm Sage, and this is Easy English with Sage.
Let me ask you something, and I want you to think about this carefully before we begin. You know someone who speaks English. Maybe you work with them. Maybe you went to school with them. Their grammar is not perfect. Their accent is not native. But when they speak, people listen. When they enter a meeting, something shifts in the room. They sound considered. They sound confident. They sound, for lack of a better word, intelligent. And then there is another person, perhaps someone you've observed, perhaps even a version of yourself, who knows English well, who has studied it for years, who understands almost everything they hear. But when they speak, something doesn't quite land. The words are correct, but the impression is ordinary, forgettable. They finish a sentence, and the room moves on, a little too quickly. What separates these two people is not vocabulary size. It is not grammar accuracy. It is something more specific, more learnable, and more powerful than either of those things. Today, we are going to explore exactly what that is. The full title of this session is Sound More Intelligent in English, a C1 to C2 guide. And over the next hour or so, I am going to walk you through not just words and phrases, but the habits, the structures, the rhythms, and the mindset shifts that transform competent English into commanding English. If your goal is to sound confident, precise, and genuinely impressive in advanced English, in meetings, in conversations, in writing, in moments that matter, this channel is built for you. If you haven't already, consider subscribing. What we do here is consistent, serious, and designed for adults who treat language learning as a long-term investment. Now, let's begin. The first thing I want to address is a belief that holds back a surprising number of advanced learners. The belief that sounding intelligent in English means using bigger words. That if you replace important with paramount, or use with utilize, or help with facilitate, you will immediately sound more educated. This belief is not entirely wrong. Word choice does matter enormously, but here's the problem. Most learners, when they attempt this upgrade, do something that native speakers find quietly unconvincing. They use sophisticated words in unsophisticated structures. They drop a high-level word into a sentence that is still built like a beginner's sentence. And the result feels like wearing a tuxedo with trainers. The contrast is noticeable, and it works against them. Intelligent English is not about decoration. It is about architecture. It is about how you build a thought, not just how you dress it. So let us talk about architecture first, because this is the foundation everything else rests on. Think about the last time you expressed an opinion in English. Maybe in a meeting, maybe in a conversation, maybe in an email. How did you structure it? Most intermediate learners do something like this. They state the opinion, and then they stop. I think this plan is good. Or perhaps slightly more elaborated. I think this plan is good because it will save time. That is a functional sentence. It communicates something. But now listen to how an advanced speaker handles the same thought. While I appreciate the efficiency this plan promises, I'd want to make sure we're not trading short-term convenience for longer-term complications. Or, more directly, on the whole, I think the logic here is sound. My only hesitation would be around the implementation timeline. Notice what happened there. It is not just vocabulary. It is the movement of thought. There is an acknowledgement, a qualification, a direction. The speaker sounds like they have considered the issue from multiple angles, even in a single sentence. That impression of intellectual depth, that is what we are building today. So let us begin with what I call the architecture of intelligent speech. And there are 5 elements to it. The first element is qualification. Intelligent speakers rarely speak in absolutes, not because they are uncertain, but because they understand that most meaningful questions contain complexity. When you qualify your statements, you signal awareness. You signal that you have thought about the edges and the exceptions. Listen to these 2 versions of the same idea. Version 1, social media is bad for mental health. Version 2, social media can be genuinely damaging to mental health, though I think the impact varies quite significantly depending on how you use it and what you're looking for when you're on it. The second speaker sounds more thoughtful, not because they know more, but because they hold their idea with more precision. Here are some powerful qualifiers that immediately raise the level of your English. Practice saying each one clearly and with a natural rhythm. To a certain extent, this phrase acknowledges partial truth. To a certain extent, I agree with your concern. It's worth noting that this introduces information with weight, as if you are offering something valuable. It's worth noting that this approach has worked well in similar contexts. With some reservations, this shows you are engaged, careful, and honest. I'd support the proposal, with some reservations about the budget. On balance, this is the language of someone who has weighed both sides. On balance, I think the benefits outweigh the risks. By and large, a more conversational version of generally. By and large, the feedback has been positive. Now let us practice. I want you to say these aloud, not just hear them. The body learns language. Say with me, to a certain extent, I understand the frustration. Say it again, with a natural pause after extent. To a certain extent, I understand the frustration. Now this one. On balance, I think we made the right decision. And this, it's worth noting that the situation is more complex than it appears. Good. These phrases do something remarkable when you use them consistently. They make your English feel considered rather than reactive. And in professional settings especially, that distinction matters more than almost any grammar rule you have ever studied. The second element in our architecture of intelligent speech is what I call structural signposting. This is the art of guiding your listener through your thinking. When you speak without signposting, your listener has to do extra work. They have to track where your thought is going, whether you are still on the same point or moving to a new one. That effort makes them feel subconsciously that the speaker is somewhat disorganized. When you use signposts, the listener can relax. They can simply follow. And a speaker who is easy to follow always sounds more intelligent than one who is not. Here are the essential signposting phrases for advanced English. These work in conversation, in presentations, in interviews, anywhere you need to sound structured. To introduce your main point. The key thing here is, or what it really comes down to is, or the core issue as I see it is, to move from one idea to another, building on that, or that said, or which brings me to, or and connected to that point. To contrast on the flip side, or that being said, or at the same time, however, or conversely. To summarize, in short, or to put it simply, or the bottom line is, or what all of this points to really is. And this is the crucial part. The key thing here is whether the team has the flexibility to adapt. I think the idea has merit, but implementation will be the real test. That said, let us practice a few of these now. Here's another. You are in a meeting. Someone has proposed a new working schedule. You see some merit in it, but also have concerns. Use the phrase, that said, and then acknowledge the good before you introduce your hesitation. You might say, the proposal makes sense in theory. That said, I'd want to understand how it would affect our existing client commitments before I'd feel fully comfortable endorsing it. Say your version now. If you are still practicing with me right now, type "I'm serious" in the comments. It matters, not just because it tells me you're here, but because the act of making that small commitment reinforces your own decision to take this seriously. The third element of intelligent English architecture is precision. Not complexity, precision. There is a crucial difference. Complexity means using long or rare words. Precision means using the exact right word, even if it is a simple one, because it captures the meaning more accurately than the alternatives. Here is a small but instructive example. Consider the word problem. Nothing wrong with it, but notice the range of alternatives, each slightly different in meaning. An issue is often more neutral, less severe. We have an issue with the timeline sounds more professional and less alarming than we have a problem. A complication suggests something that arises unexpectedly and makes things harder. A complication arose in the final stages. A challenge frames the difficulty as something to be overcome. It has a slightly optimistic connotation. This presents a significant challenge, but I believe it's manageable. A constraint is a limitation, often structural or resource-based. Budget constraints have narrowed our options. A concern is something that gives you pause, something that worries you. My main concern is the lack of stakeholder buy-in. Now notice, none of these are rare words. You knew all of them. But choosing between them, that is precision. And precision is what separates someone who communicates from someone who communicates well. Let us practice this directly. I will give you a basic sentence. You will replace the word I highlight with a more precise alternative. There is no single right answer. The goal is to make the choice consciously. Basic sentence. There is a problem with our communication. Now, how would you say this differently depending on the context? If it's a minor recurring issue, you might say, there's a persistent gap in our communication. If it's something that's actively causing damage, there's a serious breakdown in how we're communicating. If you want to sound careful and non-blaming, there seems to be a disconnect in how information is being shared. Each version tells a slightly different story, and the ability to choose the right story, that is what intelligence sounds like. Here are more words worth practicing with this same precision-building approach. Instead of good, consider effective, promising, well-considered, encouraging, sound, solid, compelling. Instead of bad, consider problematic, counterproductive, ill-advised, concerning, insufficient, flawed. Instead of think, consider believe, suspect, anticipate, recognize, acknowledge, contend, maintain. Instead of said, consider noted, argued, observed, pointed out, emphasized, acknowledged, suggested. Instead of change, consider shift, transition, transformation, evolution, adjustment, recalibration. Notice something about that last list. Recalibration. This is a word that belongs to the world of precision instruments, of fine adjustments. When you say, we need a recalibration of our approach, you are saying it is not a major overhaul, but a careful, deliberate fine-tuning. That image is more specific than change, and it signals a speaker who thinks carefully. Say it with me. This calls for a recalibration of our priorities. Again, this calls for a recalibration of our priorities. Now, without looking, say it naturally as if you are in a meeting. Pause. Then say it. Good. That is the kind of language that people notice. Not loudly, quietly. Which is exactly how it should work. Now let me introduce you to the fourth element of our intelligent English architecture. And this one is perhaps the most underestimated of all. It is pacing and rhythm. Intelligent people in any language do not rush their thoughts. There is a particular pattern of speech that commands respect and attention, and it involves something that many learners are afraid of: deliberate pausing. Let me demonstrate. Imagine two speakers answering the same interview question. What do you consider your greatest professional strength? Speaker 1: I think my greatest strength is probably my ability to work in a team, and also I'm quite good at communication, and I try to be organized, and I think I bring a positive attitude to the workplace. Speaker 2: I'd say my greatest strength is clarity, specifically the ability to take complex information and translate it into something actionable for the people around me. The difference is not the content, it is the delivery. Speaker 2 pauses, Speaker 2 breathes, Speaker 2 gives each phrase its own space. And that creates the impression, correctly or incorrectly, that the speaker is someone who thinks clearly. Now, I want you to understand something about pausing that many learners do not realize. In your native language, you probably pause naturally, but when you speak English, you may feel anxious in the silence, as if the pause means you have lost your way, as if the listener will think you do not know what you are saying. And so you fill the silence. You say, like, so basically, and this undermines you. The next time you are speaking English in a situation that matters, give yourself permission to pause. 1 breath, 2 breaths. The silence does not make you look uncertain. It makes you look deliberate. Let us practice this rhythm now. I am going to say a sentence, and I want you to repeat it after me, with the pauses exactly where I place them. What I've come to realize is that speed of delivery matters far less than clarity of thought. Say it with me, slowly, with the pauses. What I've come to realize is that speed of delivery matters far less than clarity of thought. Once more, what I've come to realize is that speed of delivery matters far less than clarity of thought. Now try this one. The real question isn't whether we can do it. It's whether we're approaching it in the right way. Say it. The real question isn't whether we can do it. It's whether we're approaching it in the right way. Notice how the pauses create emphasis. The words after a pause carry slightly more weight than the words before it. It is a principle of rhetoric, of effective public communication, and it is older than any language exam. If this is helping you, I want to gently remind you to subscribe and turn on notifications. I release these sessions consistently, and consistency, as we are about to discuss, is one of the real markers of an advanced learner. Now let us move into our 5th element, and then we will go deeper into the vocabulary, the phrase work, and the practice scenarios that will make everything we have discussed feel real and usable. The 5th element is what I call intellectual generosity. This might sound unexpected in a language lesson, but bear with me. Intelligent speakers in English and in any language have a particular quality that earns them respect and attention. They make the people around them feel heard before they make them feel corrected. They acknowledge before they advance. They validate before they challenge. This is not softness. This is not people-pleasing. It is strategic intelligence. Because when you acknowledge someone's point before you build on it or redirect it, you accomplish 2 things simultaneously. You demonstrate that you have actually listened, and active listening is perceived as a mark of intelligence. And you lower the other person's defensiveness, which makes them more receptive to what you are about to say. Here are the phrases that enable intellectual generosity. These are some of the most powerful phrases in professional and intellectual English. That's a fair point, and it raises the question of, this acknowledges, then advances. I see where you're coming from, though I'd push back slightly on. This validates, then challenges, without aggression. You're absolutely right to flag that. I think the nuance here is this agrees on a surface level, then adds depth. That's one way to look at it. Another perspective might be this is non-confrontational and genuinely intellectual. I hadn't thought about it in quite those terms, though now you say it, I wonder if. This is the language of a person who thinks aloud, who processes in real time. It is deeply humanizing, and it sounds very natural. These phrases are not tricks. They are genuine tools for navigating intellectual conversations with grace. And when you use them, people around you feel that you are someone who listens well, thinks well, and communicates well. That combination is rare, and rare is memorable. Let us practice. I will give you a situation and a cue phrase. You complete the thought in your own words. Situation: a colleague says, I think we should delay the project until next quarter. You partially agree. You think the timing is indeed uncertain, but you also believe that delaying too long creates its own risks. Cue phrase: that's a fair point, and it raises the question of what we risk by waiting. The timeline is uncertain. I agree, but so is the market situation next quarter. Try your version. Say it aloud. Don't worry about getting it perfect. Getting it spoken is more important than getting it perfect. Now let's go deeper. We have covered the architecture, the structural habits that make English sound intelligent. Now I want to talk about vocabulary in a more targeted way. Not a word list, not memorization, but a set of vocabulary clusters that advanced, intelligent speakers reach for naturally, almost instinctively. I am going to group these by the kind of thinking they represent, because that is how language really works at the advanced level. You do not just learn words. You learn the kinds of thoughts that require certain words. And when you think a certain kind of thought in English, the right word is already there. Let us begin with what I call the vocabulary of nuanced assessment. When intelligent speakers evaluate something, a plan, an argument, a situation, a piece of work, they do not say simply good or bad. They assess. And assessment requires precise language. Here are the words and phrases in this cluster. Compelling. This means persuasive, convincing, difficult to dismiss. The argument is compelling, though not entirely conclusive. Robust. This means strong, well-constructed, able to withstand challenge. We need a more robust methodology before we can draw conclusions. In British professional English particularly, robust is a word that appears constantly in high-level discussions. Nuanced. You likely know this word, but do you use it? A nuanced understanding means one that appreciates complexity, that does not reduce things to simple categories. Her analysis was refreshingly nuanced. Provisional, meaning tentative, subject to revision. These are provisional findings. We'll know more once the full data is in. This word makes you sound careful and scientific in your thinking. Inconclusive, meaning the evidence does not yet point clearly in one direction. The results so far are inconclusive, but the trend is interesting. Substantial, meaning large in quantity or significance, more formal and precise than big or a lot. There's been a substantial shift in public perception. Marginal, meaning small, at the edge of significance. The improvement was marginal, not enough to change our overall assessment. Disproportionate, meaning not in proportion, larger or smaller than would be expected or fair. The risks seem disproportionate to the potential gains. Say these with me now, slowly with confidence in each word. The argument is compelling, but I'd stop short of calling it conclusive. We need a more robust framework here. The impact has been somewhat marginal, not transformative, but not insignificant either. The response was disproportionate to the actual risk involved. Now, and this is important, I want you to connect these words to your own life. Think of something you have been evaluating recently, a decision at work, a situation in your personal life, a piece of news you have been following, and use one of these words to describe it, right now, in your head or aloud. The situation is compelling, nuanced, inconclusive, concerning, robust. Whatever you chose, that is yours now. That is language you have used, not just observed. Let us move into the next vocabulary cluster, the language of intellectual positioning. This is the vocabulary you use when you are establishing where you stand on an issue, when you are situating your perspective in relation to others. I'd argue that this is slightly more assertive than I think, but not aggressive. It signals that you are about to make a case, not just state a preference. I'd argue that the current approach is unsustainable in the medium term. It's my contention that the benefits of this policy have been overstated. I'd be inclined to say the risk is manageable, though I'd want to review the numbers first. The evidence would suggest that consumer behavior is shifting faster than anticipated. There's a reasonable case to be made that the timeline needs to be revisited. It's hard to avoid the conclusion that the evidence is compelling. It's hard to avoid the conclusion that communication broke down somewhere in the process. These phrases are your intellectual positioning tools. They allow you to assert ideas without sounding dogmatic. They allow you to challenge without sounding combative. They make you sound, above all, like someone who has thought carefully before speaking. Repeat after me. I'd argue that this requires more careful consideration before we proceed. The evidence would suggest that the initial projections were optimistic. It's hard to avoid the conclusion that something went wrong in the planning phase. Once more, and this time say it as if you are actually in the room addressing someone. Give it presence. I'd argue that this requires more careful consideration before we proceed. Good. Now let us move into a section of the lesson that I want you to pay particularly close attention to, because what I am about to share is something that most learners at this level have never been explicitly taught. And yet it is, in my experience, one of the greatest separators between English that sounds proficient and English that sounds genuinely intelligent. It is the skill of making connections visible. Here is what I mean. In everyday English, when people move from one thought to another, they often just move. The project is delayed. We need more resources. There is a connection implied, but it is left invisible. The listener has to make the logical jump themselves. Advanced speakers make the connection explicit. They show the logical relationship between ideas. And this is what creates the impression of organized, sophisticated thinking. Here are the connective structures that do this work. I want you to listen not just to the words, but to the logic they carry. Causal connections, showing cause and effect. As a direct result of, this has led to, consequently, which in turn has, the knock-on effect of this is. That last phrase, the knock-on effect, is particularly natural in British and international professional English. It means a secondary effect that follows from a primary one. The delay in delivery had a knock-on effect on our 2-3 projections. Conditional connections, showing if-then logic. Provided that, on the condition that, assuming that, were we to, then, in the event that. Notice, were we to is a conditional inversion, a more formal construction that immediately elevates the register of your English. Instead of, if we were to expand to new markets, we'd need additional support, say, were we to expand to new markets, we'd need substantially more support infrastructure. Same meaning, very different impression. Notwithstanding, despite the fact that, even so, that said, and yet, nevertheless, these words do heavy logical lifting. The proposal is well structured. Nevertheless, I have reservations about the underlying assumptions. That nevertheless tells the listener, I appreciated what came before, but something important comes next. It creates tension, and tension holds attention. Let us practice the knock-on effect phrase because it is one I particularly enjoy and one that is immediately useful. The staff shortage had a direct knock-on effect on customer satisfaction scores. Say it. The staff shortage had a direct knock-on effect on customer satisfaction scores. A lack of clear communication at the outset can have significant knock-on effects throughout the project. A lack of clear communication at the outset can have significant knock-on effects throughout the project. Think of something in your work or life where one thing caused another, a chain of effects. Describe it using the phrase knock-on effect. Aloud. Now. This is active learning. This is the kind of practice that changes how you actually speak, not just how you perform in an exercise. Let us pause here for a moment and reflect on what you have absorbed so far. We have covered qualification, signposting, precision, rhythm and pacing, intellectual generosity, the vocabulary of assessment, the language of intellectual positioning, and the art of making connections visible. Each of these is a layer. Each one on its own improves your English. Together, they transform it. And we are only beginning the second half. Tell me in the comments, which phrase or concept so far has felt most immediately useful to you? I genuinely read these responses, and they shape what I focus on in future sessions. Now, I want to take you into a territory that is slightly different from what we have covered so far. We have been focused mostly on professional and intellectual communication. But sounding intelligent in English is not only about boardrooms and meetings. It is also about the texture of everyday sophisticated conversation. The kind of conversation you have at dinner, at a social gathering, with a thoughtful colleague, with a friend who engages seriously. And in that territory, there is a set of skills that deserve their own attention. The first is the ability to express ambivalence, the experience of having mixed or uncertain feelings about something. Many learners struggle with this because they try to translate directly from their native language, and the equivalent structures sometimes do not exist, or they sound unnatural. But in English, expressing ambivalence is actually a sign of emotional and intellectual maturity. It signals that you experience the world with complexity, that you are not someone who reduces everything to simple opinions. Here are the natural ways to express ambivalence in English. I have mixed feelings about it, to be honest. It's something I find myself going back and forth on. I can see the appeal, though I'm not entirely convinced. There's something appealing about it, but I can't quite put my finger on what's holding me back. I think it's the right direction, though I'm not fully at peace with some of the trade-offs. I find it fascinating in principle, but somewhat troubling in practice. That last structure, fascinating in principle, but troubling in practice, is a particularly elegant way to hold two positions simultaneously. It shows that you appreciate complexity. It shows intellectual honesty. Say it with me. I find it compelling in principle, but I have reservations about it in practice. Once more. I find it compelling in principle, but I have reservations about it in practice. Now, change the adjectives to fit something you genuinely have mixed feelings about. Say your own version. The second element of sophisticated everyday conversation is the ability to engage with hypotheticals, to think through imagined scenarios with fluency and confidence. Hypothetical thinking is one of the highest order cognitive functions in any language. When you can discuss what might happen, what could have happened, what would be the case under different conditions, you demonstrate a kind of cognitive flexibility that is deeply impressive in any context. The language structures for this are hypothetically speaking. This signals you are entering the realm of conjecture. Hypothetically speaking, if resources were not a constraint, I'd approach this very differently. In an ideal world, this acknowledges the gap between reality and aspiration. In an ideal world, we'd have had more time to test this properly. Were that the case? Conditional inversion again. Were that the case? I think our options would look quite different. Supposing for a moment that a thoughtful way to introduce a what-if. Supposing for a moment that the initial data was flawed, what would that mean for our conclusions? Imagine, for the sake of argument, that a more discursive conversational version, often used in debate or intellectual discussion. Let us practice one full sequence using hypothetical language. I will describe a situation, and I want you to respond using one of these structures. Situation. A friend asks you whether you would change careers if money were not a factor. A response using intelligent English might sound like, hypothetically speaking, if financial security wasn't a consideration, I think I'd probably move into something closer to education. Not necessarily teaching formally, but something that involves passing on knowledge in a more direct way. There's something about that kind of work that I find genuinely compelling. Now try it yourself. What would your answer be? Use hypothetically speaking or in an ideal world to begin. Say it aloud, right now. The third element of sophisticated conversation is the ability to discuss ideas, not just experiences. This is a distinction that separates very advanced learners from those who are still mostly narrating. Narrating means telling people what happened, what you did, what you think about specific events. Discussing ideas means engaging with concepts, with principles, theories, arguments, paradoxes. When you discuss ideas, you naturally reach for a different register. Let me give you a set of phrases that belong to this register. There's a fundamental tension between and. This raises interesting questions about. What's particularly counterintuitive here is there's a certain irony in the fact that it's tempting to assume, but in reality, this gets to something more fundamental, which is the underlying assumption here seems to be, let us look at two of these more carefully. What's particularly counterintuitive here is this phrase signals that you are about to challenge an assumption that most people hold. Counterintuitive means it goes against what you would naturally expect. What's particularly counterintuitive here is the more effort you put into memorizing individual words, the slower your overall language acquisition tends to be. There's a certain irony in the fact that this phrase signals that you have noticed an unexpected contradiction. There's a certain irony in the fact that the platforms designed to connect us often leave people feeling more isolated. These are the kinds of observations that make you stand out in a conversation. Not because you are being clever for the sake of it, but because you are engaging honestly with the complexity of what you are discussing. Say them with me. What's particularly counterintuitive here is that slowing down actually helps you sound more fluent. There's a certain irony in the fact that the people who worry most about their English are often the ones who communicate most thoughtfully. Notice that second sentence. I meant that. If you are here, practicing this carefully, you are already the kind of learner who will get there. The anxiety you feel about your English is, in a way, evidence of the intelligence you bring to it. Now, let us shift into a focused vocabulary section. We have been working with structures and architecture. Let us now add some specific lexical items, words and phrases that, when used correctly, carry immediate credibility. I want to introduce you to what I call high signal vocabulary. These are words that, when used precisely, immediately signal a high level of education and intellectual engagement. Not because they are obscure, most of them are fairly common at the C2 level, but because of the contexts in which they appear. The first group is the vocabulary of causality and mechanism, underpin, to form the basis or foundation of something. This assumption underpins the entire argument. Notice you would not say underpin about a physical structure in everyday speech. It belongs to the vocabulary of ideas, of systems, of logic. Stem from, to originate or grow from. The problem stems from a misalignment of expectations. More precise than comes from, and more vivid. Give rise to cause or produce. The policy gave rise to a number of unintended consequences. A formal, slightly literary phrase that sounds very considered. Hinge on, to depend entirely on. The success of this plan hinges on stakeholder buy-in. A concrete physical image, a door hinging on its frame, used to express intellectual dependency. Compound, as a verb, to make something worse or more complex. The communication breakdown was compounded by the absence of clear leadership. A powerful word that implies layered difficulty. Say each of these in a sentence now. The effectiveness of any communication hinges on the listener as much as the speaker. Many of the current challenges stem from decisions made several years ago. Rapid change often gives rise to unexpected social pressures. The initial problem was compounded by poor planning. Notice how each sentence feels grounded and precise. Not elaborate, precise. Let us continue. The second group of high signal vocabulary is what I call the language of evaluation and critique. These are words that allow you to assess something, particularly an argument, a piece of work, an approach, with fine-grained accuracy. Flawed, containing a significant error or weakness. The argument is not entirely without merit, but it's fundamentally flawed. Overstated, exaggerated beyond what the evidence supports. I think the risks have been somewhat overstated in the current discussion. Understated, insufficient emphasis, not given enough weight. The benefits, by contrast, have been rather understated. Premature, occurring or judged before sufficient information is available. I'd argue that any conclusion at this stage would be premature. Reductive, oversimplified, reducing something to fewer elements than it actually contains. That interpretation feels a little reductive to me. The situation is considerably more layered. Speculative, based on conjecture rather than established fact. At this point, anything I say about long-term impact would be speculative. Well-founded, based on good reason or evidence. The concern seems well-founded. It's not something we can dismiss. Tenuous, very thin, fragile, lacking substance. The connection between these two factors seems rather tenuous. These words are the vocabulary of a careful thinker. When you use them, you signal not just knowledge, but judgment. And judgment, the ability to assess quality, weigh evidence, and draw measured conclusions, is perhaps the most compelling signal of intelligence in any language. Let us practice. The assumption seems well-founded on first reading, but on closer inspection, it may be more tenuous than it appears. Say it. The assumption seems well-founded on first reading, but on closer inspection, it may be more tenuous than it appears. I think the risk has been somewhat overstated, which has, ironically, distracted from concerns that are more well-founded. Say it with me. And as you say it, try to feel the logic you are expressing, the movement from one assessment to another. Now, I want to take you into something slightly different. We have been focusing largely on analytical and professional language. But intelligence in English is also expressed in the way you tell stories, in the way you narrate experience. And narrative intelligence is something that many C1 learners have not yet fully developed. Here's the thing about storytelling in English. There is a particular architecture to a well-told story in English, and it is different from the architecture in many other languages. English storytelling tends to be structured around tension and resolution. It tends to favor concrete, specific detail over general statement, and it tends to use temporal language with great precision. Let me give you an example. Compare these two ways of telling the same story. Version 1. I had a difficult time at work last year. There was a point last year, around the middle of the year, when I found myself genuinely questioning the direction of a project I'd been leading. It wasn't any single moment, it was more of a gradual realization that something was off. And managing that, holding the team's confidence while working out what needed to change, that was probably the most demanding professional experience I've had in years. What I didn't fully appreciate at the time was, this creates the sense of retrospective wisdom. The speaker knows something now that they didn't know then. This is a very sophisticated narrative move. Looking back, I think the turning point was similarly retrospective, and it signals that the speaker has reflected, not just recalled. It wasn't any single thing, it was more of a gradual accumulation of. This is the language of nuance in narrative. It resists simple causation and acknowledges complexity. I found myself in the position of having to. This phrase creates the sense of an external situation pressing in on the speaker. They didn't choose the situation, they were placed in it. It adds texture and realism. What struck me most, looking back, was a phrase that introduces an insight or an unexpected observation. It makes the listener feel they are about to hear something worth hearing. Say these with me now. I want you to just feel the rhythm and the texture of each phrase. There was a point when I wasn't sure whether I was making progress or just going through the motions. What I didn't fully appreciate at the time was how much the context was shaping my decisions. It wasn't any single factor, it was more of a slow accumulation of small things that eventually became impossible to ignore. Now, and I want you to actually do this, think of one experience from your professional life or your personal life that was genuinely challenging. Not the worst thing that has ever happened to you, just something difficult. Something where you had to navigate uncertainty or pressure. And now describe it, using at least two of these narrative structures, aloud. Do it now. It does not have to be perfect. It has to be spoken. This kind of practice, narrating real experience in English, is one of the most powerful ways to develop fluency at this level because it is not abstract. It is connected to your actual life, and the language that is connected to your life is the language that stays. We are now moving into the final section of this session, and I want to bring together everything we have covered in a way that feels cumulative, that builds toward the confidence of a speaker who has genuinely internalized these skills. But before we do that, I want to address one more thing, something I have not yet spoken about directly, but which underlies everything in this session. It is the relationship between vocabulary and identity. Here's what I mean by that. There is a particular kind of learner, and I suspect some of you recognize this, who knows the advanced vocabulary, who understands the grammar, who can hear the difference between their current English and the English they want to have. But when the moment comes to actually use it in a real conversation, in a real meeting, in a real situation with real stakes, they revert. They go back to the simpler, safer, more familiar language. even though they know better. Why does this happen? It happens because language is not just a skill, it is a habit. And habits are patterns of behavior that have been reinforced over time. Every time you use the simpler word in the past, every time you said problem instead of complication, every time you said I think instead of I'd argue, you reinforce that pattern. And now the simpler pattern is the default. Changing it is not a matter of knowing more. It is a matter of practicing differently, specifically and consistently. This is why I ask you to say things aloud during these sessions, not to check your pronunciation, but to build the muscular memory, the habit of reaching for these structures before the conversation moves on. Here is a specific practice I want you to adopt outside of this session. It takes less than 10 minutes a day, and it accelerates fluency faster than almost anything else I know of. Every evening, take one experience from your day, one conversation, one meeting, one situation, and describe it in English to yourself, out loud, using the most precise and sophisticated language you can access. Give yourself 2 minutes. Do not prepare in advance. Just speak. The first week, this will feel awkward. You will pause more than you want to. You will reach for a word and not find it, and have to settle for something simpler. That is fine. That is the process. By the third week, you will notice something. The pauses will become shorter. The language will come more quickly. The phrases we have practiced today will start appearing naturally, without you consciously choosing them. That is not magic. That is language acquisition. That is your brain building new neural pathways through consistent use. And it works. Now, let us move into the final fluency sequence of today's session. What I want to do in these final minutes is take everything we have practiced today and move through it at a slightly higher pace to simulate the rhythm of real conversation, to give you the experience of stringing these structures together fluidly. I will model some longer passages of English using everything we have covered. I want you to listen carefully, not to analyze, but to absorb. Let the language wash over you. Let the rhythm become familiar. And then I will ask you to respond or mirror. Here is the first passage. Imagine you are being asked in an interview about how you handle ambiguity at work. Honestly, it's something I've had to develop a genuine tolerance for over the years, because the environments I've worked in rarely come with clean answers or clear timelines. What I've come to appreciate, though, is that ambiguity is often where the most interesting work happens. When the path is obvious, most people can navigate it. The real test is when the situation is genuinely unclear, and you have to make decisions based on incomplete information while keeping your team confident and focused. My approach tends to be acknowledge the uncertainty openly, rather than pretending it doesn't exist, and then get very specific about what we do know and what our next concrete step is. Because even in an ambiguous situation, there is usually something you can be clear about. And that clarity is where momentum comes from. Take a moment. Let that settle. Notice the structures in there. The acknowledgement of development over time. The use of what I've come to appreciate. The framing of ambiguity as a site of interesting work. The contrast between obvious paths and unclear situations. The specific description of an approach. Now I want you to take that same question, how do you handle ambiguity, and answer it in your own words. Not my words, your own experience, your own perspective, but using the structures we have worked with today. Take a breath and speak. Here's the second passage. This one is about a topic you might discuss in a social setting, the relationship between expertise and overconfidence. There's a phenomenon that I find genuinely fascinating and somewhat troubling if I'm honest. which is the way that expertise in one area can breed an unwarranted confidence in others. People who are highly capable in their field sometimes carry that confidence into domains where they have far less foundation. And the concerning part isn't the confidence itself, it's that it can be very convincing, precisely because genuine expertise and its imitation can sound remarkably similar from the outside. What distinguishes them, I think, is the way an expert handles challenge. A genuine expert tends to welcome scrutiny. They know where the edges of their knowledge are, and they're honest about it. Whereas someone who is mimicking expertise tends to deflect or become defensive when pressed. Which is perhaps a useful reminder that intellectual humility is not a sign of weakness. It is, if anything, a marker of real depth. That passage contains high signal vocabulary, structural signposting, intellectual positioning, and a closing observation that reframes the entire argument. It is also an example of how speaking about ideas, rather than just experiences, elevates the register of your conversation naturally. Now choose a phenomenon that you find interesting or troubling, something in society, in your industry, in human nature, and speak about it for 1 minute using the kind of language we have been building today. No preparation, no rehearsal. Let us do one more passage. This one moves into the territory of personal reflection, the kind of honest, thoughtful self-expression that is deeply impressive at this level. When I think about the version of myself who first started working seriously on my English, and this was years ago now, I'm struck by how much of the difficulty I experienced was not linguistic. It was something more interior than that. It was the discomfort of not sounding like myself. In my native language, I felt articulate. I felt like I could hold my own in any conversation. But in English, I felt like I was operating at a fraction of my actual capacity. And that gap between what you can think and what you can say is genuinely humbling. What I've come to understand, though, is that the gap doesn't close through more grammar study or more vocabulary lists. It closes through the willingness to live in the discomfort, to keep speaking even when you know you're not quite expressing yourself the way you want to. Because the more you speak, the more the language shapes itself around your actual thoughts. And one day you realize the gap has narrowed, not disappeared, maybe never entirely, but narrowed to the point where it no longer holds you back. Say it with me, not the whole thing, but the closing thought. Repeat after me. The gap doesn't close through more grammar study. It closes through the willingness to live in the discomfort, to keep speaking even when you're not quite expressing yourself the way you want to. Say it again. The gap closes through the willingness to live in the discomfort, to keep speaking. And one more time, with conviction, to keep speaking. Because that, more than any vocabulary list, more than any grammar rule, more than any clever phrase, that is the truth of advanced language learning. And you are here, which means you already know it. Let us do our final practice sequence now. This is the part of the session where we move faster, with more rhythm, more confidence, less hesitation. This is where you feel the progress. I am going to give you a series of sentence starters. You complete them, out loud, immediately. Do not think too long. Trust what you have absorbed. This is about building the reflex, the automatic reach for advanced language. I'd argue that. Finish the sentence with something you genuinely believe. What's particularly counterintuitive about this is, describe something that surprised you recently. The evidence would suggest that. Make a calm, considered assertion about something you have observed. On balance, give a measured verdict on something you have been thinking about. Looking back, what I didn't fully appreciate at the time was, there's a fundamental tension between feeling the need to prove yourself and being comfortable with what you know. It's hard to avoid the conclusion that, in many areas of life, clarity and simplicity are often more powerful than complexity. What I've come to realize is that being understood in any language depends not just on the words you use, but on the clarity of your thoughts and the confidence in your delivery. This is what advanced English feels like when it is working. Not performance, not effort, but structure, rhythm, precision, and presence, coming together in real speech, carrying real thought. And now, as we approach the close of this session, I want to leave you with something that I think matters more than any individual phrase we have practiced today. Sounding intelligent in English is not ultimately about language. It is about thinking, and then having the tools to let that thinking be heard. You already think intelligent thoughts. You already have opinions worth hearing, analyses worth sharing, stories worth telling. What you are building through work like today's is not the intelligence itself. You already have that. What you are building is the channel for it, the vocabulary, the structure, the rhythm, the confidence to let your actual intelligence move through the English language with the same ease and authority it moves through your own. That is the real goal, and it is achievable, not in one session, not in 1 month, but through the kind of consistent, deliberate, serious practice that brings you to places like this. So here is what I want to leave you with, practically speaking. Take 3 phrases from today that felt most natural to you. Write them down. Use them this week, in a conversation, in an email, in a meeting, in a voice message to a colleague. Use them in real life. Once you have used a phrase in a real context, it is yours. It moves from the passive vocabulary, the words you recognize, into the active vocabulary, the words you reach for. Continue the daily 2-minute speaking practice, the one I described earlier, describing one experience from your day in English out loud every evening. Keep doing it, even when it feels routine, especially when it feels routine. Routine is how habits form. And come back here, not just to this session, but to the wider practice of structured, serious engagement with advanced English. The learners who reach the level they are aiming for are not always the most talented. They are the most consistent. You have spent time here today not just learning words, but learning to think in a certain way, a more precise, more structured, more confident way. That shift does not disappear when the session ends. It stays with you. Keep going. Keep speaking. Keep reaching for the more precise word, the more elegant structure, the more considered response. Not because you want to impress anyone, but because you know that somewhere between the thought you are having and the words you are finding, there is a version of your English that is exactly as intelligent as your mind. That version is not far away. It is, with the right practice, inevitable. I'm Sage. This is Easy English with Sage. Take care of yourself, keep at it, and I will see you in the next session.